There is a creek in Bloomington, Minnesota that was named for a distance. Not for a person, not for a feature, not for anything it does, for a distance. 9 miles. It is late August, early evening, and I am walking down it from north to south, following the water as it drops toward the Minnesota River. It is a small trail. It takes about 40 minutes end to end. But the ravine it cuts is the youngest thing in this landscape, and almost everything else in the story is older than the country it sits in. Nine Mile Creek runs through the western suburbs of Minneapolis, gathering water from Minnetonka, Hopkins, Edina, Richfield, Eden Prairie, and Bloomington before it empties into the Minnesota River. The stretch I am walking is near the very end of that journey, down in Bloomington, where the creek finally gives up its elevation and slides into a valley that is far too big for it. Why that valley is too big is the first thing worth explaining, because nothing else here makes sense without it. The trail drops almost immediately. Within a minute, the traffic noise is behind you, the canopy closes over the path, and you are walking in a green corridor that feels a great deal further from the city than it actually is. The creek is somewhere below and to the left. You can hear it well before you can see it. To understand this valley, you have to begin with a lake that no longer exists. Around 13,000 years ago, the retreating ice sheet dammed an enormous body of meltwater across what is now Manitoba, Ontario, North Dakota, and Minnesota, Glacial Lake Agassiz. At its greatest extent, it held more water than all 5 of the Great Lakes put together. It sat there, held in place by ice, and eventually the ice gave way. All of that water had to go somewhere. It went south. When Lake Agassiz breached, the outflow became Glacial River Warren, and it cut a valley straight across the state with a violence that is genuinely difficult to picture. The first great incision happened around 11,500 years ago. The river returned periodically after that, roughly between 9,600 and 8,200 years ago, deepening the cut each time. What it left behind is the trench the Minnesota River occupies today. And here is the creek itself, shallow, rocky, and completely unhurried in August. In spring, it moves with real force, and the width of exposed cobble along these banks is the evidence of what it can do when it wants to. Geologists have a precise term for what River Warren left behind. The Minnesota River today is an underfit stream, meaning it flows through a valley far too large to have been carved by it. That valley runs roughly 45 meters deep at its mouth and around 70 meters deep near Mankato. The modern river is a small tenant in an enormous house. 9 Mile Creek is a tributary cutting its own narrow ravine down into that oversized valley. And that ravine is exactly what I am walking through. Which brings us to the bridges. This trail crosses the water again and again, because in a ravine this narrow there is often no room for both the creek and the path on the same side. The crossings are the signature of this trail. The route is carried over the creek and its marshy margins on a run of boardwalks and timber bridges, and the full loop here is usually counted at 8 of them. That is not decoration. A creek in a steep ravine wanders, floods, and undercuts its own banks, and the cheapest durable answer is to stop fighting it and go over the top. Every crossing is an admission that the water was here first and intends to stay. Between crossings, the path runs level for a while along the side of the ravine, and the whole corridor is dense, green, and loud, with late summer insects. Where this creek meets the Minnesota River, there was a village. In the 1780s, a Dakota community stood at the mouth of 9 Mile Creek in what is now Bloomington. Its name was Titankatanana, which translates as the Old Village, a name that most likely records it as the first Dakota community established along this stretch of the river. It was not a small settlement. Roughly 1,900 people lived there, under a leader recorded as Chief Panasha. The creek has a Dakota name as well, and it is a considerably better name than the English one, Iutapinapsinwanka. It means the stream of he who fears nothing, and it is thought to refer to Takuni Fefsnai, whose own name carried that same meaning, and who was chief of Titankatanana in the early 1830s. One name describes a man. The other, as we are about to see, describes a measurement. Every crossing, every switchback, every meter of descent is taking me closer to where that village stood. So the name on the sign, 9 Mile Creek, is not 9 miles long. Its main stem runs about 15 miles. The number is a survey convenience. The point where the creek crossed the old Shakopee Road happened to sit 9 miles southwest of Fort Snelling, and the fort was the reference point for everything in this territory. So the creek was named for its distance from a garrison rather than for anything about the creek. The Dakota name described the water. The English name described the gap between the water and somebody else's fort. Low evening light coming through the canopy, and the trail almost entirely to myself. In 1843, 2 brothers, Gideon and Samuel Pond, established a mission on the Minnesota River in what is now Bloomington, near a relocated Dakota village. It was called Oak Grove, and it ran for about a decade. The Ponds had learned the Dakota language and preached and taught in it, and a small number of Dakota attended the school and the services there. It is one of the few institutions from this period that left a written record in both languages. Life in this valley followed the weather closely. Through autumn and winter, families sheltered in tippies down on the valley floor where the bluffs cut the wind. In summer, they moved up onto the top of those bluffs into bark lodges, out of the heat and away from the mosquitoes below. The high ground was also where the dead were buried, on scaffolds, above the river. The same topography that shaped the walking also shaped the year. Then came 1851. In two treaties, Traverse des Sioux and Mendota, roughly 24 million acres were open to settlement. Gideon Pond served as an interpreter and signed the Mendota Treaty. The terms of both, and the manner in which they were obtained, have been contested from the moment they were signed and remain contested now. Titankatanana was abandoned in 1851. Most of the Dakota were removed from this area. A community of 1,900 people that had stood at the mouth of this creek for something on the order of 70 years was gone within a single year, and the ground it had occupied was surveyed, sold, and farmed. The creek kept running through the middle of it. That is worth sitting with for a second. The water is the one participant in this entire story that never left. Farms became lots. In the decades after the Second World War, Bloomington and its neighbors filled in very fast, and the watershed above this creek turned from field and marsh into roofs, roads, and parking. Water that used to soak slowly into the ground now runs straight off it. A creek that had absorbed whatever the landscape sent it for 8,000 years was suddenly handed a completely different job, and it was given no time at all to adjust. You can read the result in the channel. That width is not August water. That is the room this creek needs on the day the suburb drains into it all at once. By the 1950s, the flooding had become serious enough and frequent enough that the residents of these suburbs did something fairly unusual about it. They did not simply complain to their cities. They petitioned the state. On the 30th of September, 1959, the 9 Mile Creek Watershed District was formed. It was the fourth watershed district established in Minnesota, but it was the first urban one, which made it something of a live experiment in governing water across city lines. Two pieces of legislation made it possible: the Federal Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act of 1953 and Minnesota's own Watershed Act of 1955. For its first 30 years, the district was effectively a flood control agency, and it built 6 major projects to hold water back: the Marsh Lake Dam, Normandale Lake, the flood storage area at Bredesen Park, outlets at Bush Lake and at Smedina Lake, culvert improvements at Hopkins. A good deal of the calm, ornamental water in this watershed is not natural calm. It is engineered calm, and it was engineered on purpose. which is worth remembering when somewhere like this feels untouched. It is managed. It is simply managed well enough that you do not notice. There's a second problem here, and unlike the flooding, you cannot see this one at all. It arrives every winter. 9 Mile Creek sits on Minnesota's impaired waters list for chloride, which comes off the salt spread on roads, car parks, and pavements. Among the Minnesota River Basin streams monitored by the Metropolitan Council, this creek carries the second highest chloride concentration of any of them. Chloride does not break down, settle out, or evaporate. Once it is in the water, it stays in the water. The creek is also listed for impaired biota, on the basis of low scores on the Fish Index of Biotic Integrity, which is a formal way of saying there is less living in here than there should be. To bring this water back inside the state standard, the chloride load across the whole watershed would have to fall by roughly 62%. And it looks completely clean. That is the entire difficulty with this particular kind of damage. There is nothing to photograph. The work now looks very different from the work in 1959. The district runs streambank stabilization and restoration projects along the creek, rebuilding banks that decades of flashy suburban runoff have cut out from underneath. It is slower, less dramatic, and far less visible than building a dam. It is also much closer to what the creek actually needs from us. One more bridge, and the trail begins dropping again. The valley is opening out ahead now. Somewhere down there, this creek ends and the Minnesota River takes over, and that confluence is where the old village stood. 9 miles from a fort that mattered to somebody else. A creek named for its distance from a garrison, a valley cut by a lake that drained 13,000 years ago, a village of 1,900 people that ended inside a single year, a flood problem solved by committee, and a salt problem still waiting, and a small green ravine in a Minneapolis suburb that you cross and recross on timber, where every bit of that is still legible if you know what you are looking at. If you want more walks like this one, with the history that goes with them, subscribe and come along.